Welcome to The Sounds of Sand, a podcast inquiring into the beauty and mystery of existence beyond ultimate truths. Welcome back. This is Michael Riley. In today's episode, we're honored to welcome friend of Science and Nonduality, Federico Faggin, a luminary in the world of high technology. Federico is the inventor of the microprocessor and the MOS silicon gate technology, foundational elements in modern information technology. And now he's turned his focus to the nature of consciousness and reality. And we discuss Federico's new book, which is entitled Irreducible. Federico explores the profound connection between the classical and quantum realms, artificial intelligence, and the human mind. And join us as Federico shares his insights on consciousness as the fundamental property of the universe and the need to integrate science and spirituality to better understand our reality and address the challenges we all face today. On today's episode of the Sounds of Sand podcast, presented by Science and Nonduality. All right, I'm here with Federico Faggin. Thank you so much for being on the Sounds of Sand podcast and reconnecting with the Science and Nonduality community.
Thank you.
Nice. So there's a lot to talk about today. You have this beautiful new book, Irreducible. But before we get into the what of your theory of consciousness, I thought we'd start with the why. You know, we're living in a time of climate collapse and war and genocide and the dangers of AI, which I hope we also get into today. But why is this question of exploring the nature of consciousness and reality important, especially in these times, do you think?
I think it is essential because the current worldview, which is based on materialism and reductionism, reduces human beings to machines. And therefore, if we are machines, we can be bested by other machines. And in fact, you see all the big issues that are coming out with artificial intelligence these days that compare us to machines and make predictions like machines can be conscious and so on. So if we have this view of ourselves, and we also view life as motivated by the survival of the fittest as opposed to cooperation, in other words, by competition instead of cooperation, we will continue to have the very difficult reality that we are living, like wars and famines and disasters that are caused primarily by our competitive nature and the need to be superior to each other. So, is there any reason to be machines? You know, is that true? I mean, is science really saying that we are machines? No, science is not. In fact, quantum physics has aspects that generally are not very well understood that would negate the materialistic view of reality that requires a deterministic world, requires a world in which the next state is completely determined by the previous state. So if we can then join the interiority, which is what consciousness and free will create for us, with the exteriority, which is what science primarily studies these days, then we can create a better world by understanding our true nature. In other words, joining science and spirituality, where spirituality is the capacity that we have to have a experience of oneness, the totality of what exists, and the capacity that we do have to actually know directly that we're not separate from the whole. And science, which studies the phenomena in space and time, which has been highly successful, but cannot explain the reality and the existence of consciousness and free will today. In fact, materialist scientists believe that free will does not exist and that consciousness is really an epiphenomenon of the brain. So this new theory changes the idea of who we are in a fundamental way, completely changes the worldview that we have, and restores meaning and purpose to the universe that materialism has essentially denied. We can only change our world if we change our mind about who we are and about what the world is. And so I consider the most important step forward for humanity today to understand that we are beings of light, not machines like computers. Mm-hmm. And that is really my purpose that has motivated me for the last 35, 37 years.
Beautiful. Yeah, I love your focus on the importance of the experience of consciousness, and use this phrase, beings of light. And I think it's important for listeners to hear something you describe in your book, which is your awakening experience that you had decades ago. Would you mind talking about that and how that relates to the emergence of this new theory?
Oh, of course, because it was the fundamental input to a reality that I had no idea that existed. I have to go back to the late 80s. At that time, I'm a physicist, so I was a materialist. I had studied physics. I believe in the description of reality, the physics, quantum physics, and classical physics. I thought that we are machines, complex, sophisticated machines, but nonetheless, machines. So in that situation, I was essentially paying attention only to the outer world. I mean, my inner world has really not much meaning. If I didn't feel good, I tended to suppress that feeling. I basically was too busy running companies. I was an entrepreneur in those days. I was on to my third company called Synaptics. And therefore, for me, reality was out there. There was nothing inside. But at that time, I was not happy, as I had reached everything that the world says that if you do, you should be happy. I had a beautiful family, everybody healthy. I had more money than I needed. I didn't need to work anymore. I had enough money to live out of what I had already achieved. I was well known in the field of computers and semiconductors. And so what's wrong with this picture? And at that time, I was studying neuroscience, so I wanted to understand consciousness. I realized that consciousness could not be reduced to electrical signals in the brain. That was what later David Chalmers called the difficult problem of consciousness. In other words, how can you go from electrical signals in the brain to qualia, the sensations and feelings that we feel within ourselves? And I had realized that problem by studying neuroscience. And of course, my problem was a problem of conscience. So I wanted to understand consciousness. So I wanted to understand what is consciousness. And I was intense about that. And it was in this climate of intensity and desire to know, and also desire to heal the problem that I feel, or understand it at least, that I had this extraordinary experience during the Christmas holidays of 1990 and skiing with my children, and we were having a great time. So it was the perfect quiet time to enjoy family and so on. And one night I woke up in the middle of the night. I was thirsty, went to get a glass of water. It was around midnight. I went back to bed. And as I was just trying to go back to sleep, thinking of nothing, all of a sudden, from my chest comes this energy, but it was physical. It was not a thought or an imagination. It was a physical thing. It was a white, scintillating light, and it felt like love, but love so powerful that the like of it I never felt in my life. I mean, it was way beyond any love. And even more incredible, how could it be the source of love? I mean, remember, I was like stunned by me generating love. And this love was not only love, but it was also a peace in the sense that it was me. I felt like at home, and it was joy. It was joyful. It felt great. This was like this combination I never felt before in my life. And then this energy exploded and covered all the visual, all the space, same white scintillating light. But now my consciousness is in this light. So now I am also outside myself, not only within my body, but also this energy that also felt like me. Now I am that. So now I am both the observer and the observed. And the sense that I had, it was that this energy and the thought that came was, wow, this is the stuff of which everything is made. So it was a realization that this substance that feels like love, joy, and peace is, and that was the end of the end of the experience. And of course, it goes without saying that something like that changed completely my sense of who I was. Before I thought I was separate from the world. Now I am the world observing itself, but with my point of view, because my point of view, my sense of me did not change throughout this experience. I was still me, the same me that I was when I was 5 years old. So this kind of foundational change in my way of conceiving reality, because this experience brought with it the conviction, the sense that this is true. The essence of this experience has to be true. It cannot be different than this. And in fact, the theory that I have now in some way explains and reflects and also was inspired, but through a rational process and through study and through further work to arrive at the theory that we will describe later. So this was the beginning of a journey that took me for 20 years through all kinds of psychospiritual experiences and work. About 30-40% of my work for the following 30 years was dedicated to understanding this nature of reality. New nature of reality was revealed to me. And through this process, I had many other extraordinary experiences of consciousness that reveal other aspects of consciousness so that I could have a sense of this animal that we call consciousness. And of course, it was very clear that free will had to be part of this thing, because consciousness without free will cannot direct experience, and free will without consciousness cannot have self-knowing. So we have to have both. They have to work together. And so the conception of reality of physics was immediately appended by this experience. But of course, being a physicist, being a scientist, I wanted to understand before jumping to conclusion. And so at the end of 20 years, it was very clear to me that consciousness and free will had to be fundamental properties of nature. They could not derive from the brain. They went beyond what the brain does. They had to be property of a reality deeper than space-time and so on. But how do you make a theory out of that? And so that's when I decided to leave everything that I was doing. I sold my last company. I got out of all the boards and things that I was doing. And I decided to dedicate myself to the study of consciousness. This was about 2008, 2009. And then I started a foundation in 2011 for the study of consciousness, and where I could actually provide support to people like me that were thinking, trying to understand this nature of consciousness, not as a phenomenon of the brain, but as something deeper than phenomenon of the brain. Of course, there are phenomena of the brain that affect the experience of consciousness, but the capacity to experience comes from consciousness and is not in the brain. So I stop here, otherwise I keep on talking. But
no, it's wonderful to hear that. It's I can tell that this experience obviously has stayed with you, and it gave you sort of a shortcut to what you were looking for. Because I think a lot of people in this realm, maybe they spend time in sort of philosophical or ontological patterns, like you say in your book. In the study of reality, we have fallen into a trap because we have mistaken the symbol for the meaning. We have given the value of reality to the symbol and denied reality to the meaning. And this happens because we are filled more with information than with knowledge.
Yeah, and this was a direct experience, what I now also call a lived experience. And I now can articulate this, that we do understand only through direct experiencing, through these lived experiences, when we become what we experience. So consciousness is exactly this capacity that we can become what we experience. It goes way beyond what any machine can do.
One more question before we get into the actual theory, because I think this helps set it up. And this is also from the introduction in your book. You talk about the Italian verbs, conoscere and sapere, and the difference between that. And this points also to this idea of the felt experience and direct experience. Could you talk about those two verbs and how we translate them in English, both to knowing, but actually they're quite different, and there's a very distinct flavor to each of those verbs.
Yeah, I realized this when I was writing Irreducible in Italian, and because the first part of the book was written in English, and then I also wrote the second part of the book in English, because I've been here since 1968. But then I didn't like the second part, and I didn't understand why. And then I realized that it was exactly because in Italian we have two words for to know. With the English language, there is only to know. And to know can be the knowledge that you get of a computer, for example, the knowledge of a computer, which is information, basically symbols. But to render the symbols are understood in the sense that they are converted into meaning, into comprehension and meaning within consciousness. There is no word. We use knowing instead of knowledge, but it's ambiguous. And that was exactly what was difficult for me to express in English when I was describing this second part of the book, these issues. So I decided to write the thing in Italian, and then it came out much better, exactly by using conoscere, which is the more inner, the meaning aspect of sapere. Sapere is the knowledge, the one that you can repeat like a machine repeats what you tell it to from what you gave it, or the person that repeats what he read without understanding it. We do that like machines do. But our real power is when we understand what we read. And even more, the real power is when we experience directly with a lived experience what we then know. And know in the sense of conoscere, we know it from within as a direct knowledge. And of course, that can only be understood if one has those type of experiences, because our ordinary experiences of consciousness are not of that type. Though when a child plays and loses itself in a play, becomes the play, that is the kind of knowing that I'm talking about. You basically lose yourself in the game, in the living, in that. But that doesn't go very deep in the comprehension, but it gives a direct experience that is then a guide to comprehension later on.
Yeah. It reminds me of the T.S. Eliot quote, music heard so deeply that it's not heard at all, but you become the music as long as the music lasts.
Absolutely. In fact, music is one of those languages. There are symbols, but those symbols are translated into meaning within our consciousness. And to the degree that we are sensitive, meaning that we're able to understand the meaning of music, we can get meaning that goes way beyond what any words or books can provide, in fact, because it comes as close as possible to a direct experience of consciousness through music.
Yeah. A word in English, maybe you've heard this word before. It comes from the science fiction book, Stranger in a Strange Land, is grok. Have you heard this word?
Mm-hmm. Yeah. You grok it.
Yeah.
Yeah. When you really get it, right, almost physically, you feel it like, yeah. I understood what grok meant before having the experience that I call the awakening experience that I just described. And so grok is also when you get it in the sense, so I got it, I understand now, that's close, but it doesn't have the directness. You don't live it. You come close, but not quite. Not quite right.
Can you describe this theory then? Lay it out, take as much time as you need.
Yeah, so this theory is a theory that allows to unite science and spirituality into a coherent theory that reinterprets, it actually reinterprets all the science already knows, and also the perennial philosophy and the ways in which human beings have understood their connection with the whole throughout history. And so it is a theory that allows to now bring together science and spirituality, creating a new discipline where the boundaries don't exist anymore between the two. It's a fusion, it's a new way to look in a reality where the inner reality is given the same level or perhaps even more level of reality than the outer reality. But it allows to interpret what physics has been saying and enrich what the physicists now can do in physics by understanding that consciousness is a kind of instrument that allows to explore the interiority of nature that can only be explored with consciousness, whereas the instruments that science has been using, which are made of the same matter the body is made, can only explore the outer reality, but not the inner one. So it changes our perspective of what we are. I start with a postulate. And to understand this postulate is obvious, is self-evident. I then want to say why I had to start with this postulate. This postulate says that one, and one is defined as the totality of what exists, so all that is, one is dynamic, holistic, and wants to know itself. That's it. So what does it mean, dynamic? It means that one is never the same instant after instant. One is always changing. It always is dynamic of it. The dynamism is baked into one. One can never be the same, always changing. Holistic means that one is not made of separable parts. You cannot take parts out of one. Everything is connected within one. One connects everything from within, from the inside. So one is holistic. So far, I have described what quantum physics is saying. Quantum fields have those properties. But I have added one more property, which is one wants to know itself. Why am I adding that? Well, that's because I know within myself that the deepest desire that I have is to know myself and to know the world. And who am I? We have had that since the beginning. We have inherited that. From where? Certainly not from matter. Why would matter want to know itself? So why not one want to know itself? And of course, that also connects with the perennial philosophy. But by saying that one wants to know itself, I had defined two things. One, the wanting, which is the free will or the capacity to direct one's experience. And two, the know itself implies the existence of consciousness, which is what allows one to know itself. So consciousness isn't defined as the capacity of one to know itself, which is exactly what we have too. So now the question is, how do we come into the picture? Well, so when one wants to know itself, because if it doesn't know itself, where is the knowledge that it then comes into knowledge? There must be an aspect of one, which is an unconscious aspect of one, that not even one can know, that is the potential, a potentiality of existence, which is part of one. And so when one knows itself, since he must know itself completely because it's not made of separate parts, it cannot know a piece of itself. It has to know itself completely because it's holistic. And that knowing, therefore, brings into existence what one knows. So what is brought into existence then? An entity like one, except with the point of view with which one has known itself. So that point of view becomes the identity of that entity. That entity must have the same properties of one because it reflects one, though it reflects it only with that point of view with which one has known itself. And so that entity now is an entity that has the same potential to know itself. Basically, that's how life starts. Life starts by one duplicating itself in the process of knowing itself, except it duplicates itself many times with different points of view, because one is so vast that its self-knowing cannot be exhausted in that instance in which it knew itself and created this part whole of itself. I call it part whole, and I call it unit of consciousness, or just like the monads of Leibniz, they are the fields, the quantum fields of physics. These entities that are created by one then can be many as there are points of view of one upon itself. How many perspectives can one know itself with? Any perspective of one becomes an entity that then has a life of its own, yet remains connected with one because one is holistic. So one connects all those entities from within, and those entities in turn wants to know themselves. So in knowing themselves, one knows itself. And so that's the way in which one knows itself, by creating these entities that have the capacity to know itself and direct their own knowing, and therefore they must have free will. Free will is the capacity to direct your self-knowing, as simple as that. So all of a sudden now we have fields. Now those are like the quantum fields of physics, except they have consciousness and free will within. So they are not the same fields. I call them seities, because otherwise we can confuse a field, a quantum field, that has no consciousness and no free will within physics with what I'm talking about. But essentially it's the same concept, except now, starting with this premise, with this postulate, now I can explain why quantum physics has the crazy properties that quantum physics has. Properties that are still being discussed by physicists. They're still not understood. There are still interpretational issues. It's called the measurement problem in quantum physics, never been resolved since the beginning days of quantum physics. And this new way of looking at reality changes completely. Now you can explain, for example, the collapse of the wave function as due to a decision of free will of the quantum field. And of course, why can a quantum field make a decision? Because he's conscious, he knows what he wants. Conscious means that he knows what he wants and he can decide what to manifest. And what does he manifest? He manifests symbols. Why does he need to manifest symbols? Because what he knows within itself, the field, the conscious experience of the field, is private, cannot be transferred directly. We know that ourselves. What I feel, the love that I feel for my son, if I say, I love you, have I transferred what I feel? Not a chance. I mean, the love that I feel is dynamic, as depth, as dimensions that I know that they are there, I can hardly explore. So is something much richer. It's not a number. A symbol is a number, but a feeling is not a number. And so here we are now beginning to reach into the crucial aspect of quantum physics, which is the fact that quantum information has exactly the same properties of an inner experience. Why? Because quantum information, a pure quantum state, which is a vector, is defined as a vector in Hilbert space, a space which has n dimensions, many, potentially infinite dimensions. And the dimensions can be expressed only with complex numbers, not with real numbers, like this, the real space and time that we have.
So as a way to kind of bring it back to the personal, because that's the direct experience that many listeners are having. What is the relationship between this quantum field of consciousness that you're describing and the individual sense of consciousness? So how are the field and the individual related?
Okay. So what I have described so far is basically, in a way, the beginning of the universe where there are quantum fields. However, in this case, the quantum fields want to know themselves. So in order to know themselves, they need to communicate with shareable symbols because they cannot communicate directly what they feel. What they feel is private. I was saying earlier that one of the fundamental property of quantum physics is that the quantum state, which is the state of the field within the field, that state is private, cannot be reproduced. There is a theorem of quantum physics that says that. Not only that, but also that what can be measured of that state or can be known of that state is a small portion of it, is a bit per quantum bit. And the quantum bit is an infinity of possibilities that when they are measured, only give you 1 or 0. So basically, what quantum physics is saying that the quantum state of a field can only be known a little bit with classical symbols like bits 0, 1, and it cannot be reproduced. So it's private to the field, exactly like my conscious experience. So this explains why then, since consciousness and free will are taken as existing from the postulate that I said earlier, then this postulate, which is self-evident because we know that we're conscious and we know that we have a minimum of free will, then this postulate can actually explain why we need quantum physics. Quantum physics is a consequence of the fact that these fields are conscious and have free will. And if free will, as I said earlier, is the capacity of the field to decide what manifests, but what the field manifests as a symbol, shareable symbol to communicate what it feels, can only be a small portion of what it feels. So now, these fields now then communicate with each other to know themselves. This is the purpose of their communication. And as they know themselves, they can combine into a hierarchy of fields in which then the symbols become ever more complex to describe ever more complex and develop a sense of self. So, for example, a field of electrons communicating with the field of protons, when they have found out all that there is in common, they create a new field, which is the field of the atoms of hydrogen, of which the atom of hydrogen is the symbol. But the field is a field that manifests all the atoms of hydrogen. So the field is enormous, is vast, and the atom of hydrogen is just one instance of a symbol used by the field to communicate. The feeling is in the field, is not in the atoms or not in the particles. So likewise, our body is like a symbol of a field. We are fields of fields of fields. So we are hierarchically much beyond the fields, of course, of elementary particles that then combine, makes atoms and molecules, then macromolecules, blah, 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 and eventually, create vaster, much more sophisticated fields, which is like the field that we are. So we are simply much more evolved fields, but still with the same properties of the foundational fields that created this universe. Therefore, we are not the body. The body is simply a symbol that we use to communicate with other fields, communicate information to other fields, knowledge, self-knowledge. What matters in this new conceptualization is the self-knowing. Self-knowing is actually the currency more than matter, energy, and so on, which is the space and time, which is the currency of physics, is really the view of reality is transformed by taking knowledge, self-knowing as the foundational aspect of reality. And this changes everything clearly, because if you think about it, what is evolution? Evolution based on materialism is deterministic, but evolution based on what I'm talking about is illuminated by the increasing self-knowing of one, which is the cooperation of all these entities that communicate to know themselves and know themselves ever more. So in this case, the symbols which are structures in the field themselves. For example, the electron within quantum physics is not an object. Within quantum physics, the electron is a state of the field of electron, which is not separable from the field. So is an integral part of the field, just like a wave of the sea is not separate from the sea. So the properties of the electrons are the properties of the field, and the electron is not separable from the field. And also this theory is monistic because it shows that matter and consciousness, if you want, and the interiority and the exteriority are not separable. They are connected. What is separable is the classical physics, because classical physics makes a simple step. And the step is to presume that since aggregates of particles and atoms and so on, which are incoherent and can behave deterministically, and therefore they can support bits, for example, the classical bits, which are physical structure that are supported by this deterministic matter. Then we can describe a classical world, but a classical world can only exist within certain limits of the environment because, for example, a computer can only work if the temperature is within a very small range of temperatures, because otherwise the bit that is the currency, the logical currency with which the inner communication of the computer occurs, is no longer recognized by the various circuits of the computer. So the computer cannot work at any temperature. It can only work in restricted physical conditions in which you can pretend that you have something that is separate from the rest of reality. And that's exactly what a computer is something that behaves as separate from the world within those ranges of working conditions in which it works.
You mentioned this continuum, let's say, of the interiority and the exteriority of experiences integral to your theory.
This idea that I'm talking about is actually turning around the materialistic explanation of the experience by saying consciousness and free will must be taken as existing. They cannot be explained by mathematics, because mathematics is created by consciousness, is created by the comprehension and the capacity of consciousness to know. And so how can mathematics, that is a creation of consciousness, explain the creator? And that's what I was trying to do as well. Except more recently I said, no, I have to start with consciousness and free will as existing by postulate. And that's a very acceptable postulate, since a postulate, by definition, should be self-evident. And it is self-evident to each of us that we are conscious and that we have free will. So where, if you look at the postulate of quantum physics, those postulates are far from self-evident. In fact, even to understand them, it probably takes about 5 years of study, where here you start with a self-evident postulate, and you can actually explain why quantum physics must have those properties that have not been understood until now. And also there must be classical physics, because there must be symbols that are shareable, because the experience in the knowing, the inner knowing, cannot be shared. It must be translated into symbols and then shared through the symbols. And that explains why there has to be this communication, continuing communication among fields. So this really changes completely the paradigm, and it is based also on my own personal experiences, which I'm trying to explain with this theory. And those are clearly explained.
Great. Thank you for clarifying that. And I think that leads us somewhat into AI, because this is something I definitely wanted to speak with you about. So this property of your theory is that a consciousness cannot be reproduced. So the very fact
conscious
that
experience cannot be reproduced. Yeah.
Okay, the conscious experience cannot be reproduced. So the very fact that we can copy and paste the code for a GPT and you'll have two different GPTs running with the same exact experience.
That's exactly right.
Yeah.
Yeah. So the reason why a digital computer cannot be conscious, because the property of consciousness are not reflected in a digital computer. Because in the digital computer, the information, the state of the computer can be copied exactly. Not impartially, but exactly. Whereas our experience cannot be reproduced. We know that, but as a fact, how can I transfer to you my love? What I feel that I call love is impossible. It's a private thing. I can only transfer to you my description of the love that I feel, but that's not a full description of what I feel. It's only a little part. And in fact, the love that I feel is alive, is something that keeps on changing and modifying and creating and growing. So it's not a number. They're not numbers. See, this desire to measure everything is forcing to define things in a way that reduces who we are because the desire to measure. And that's exactly what has happened with the definition of information. Shannon information is a probability, is inversely proportional to the probability that a symbol appears in a series of symbols. So simply is a probability which is a co-logarithm of the probability. I don't want to get into math, but fundamentally it is a measure where the more you expect a certain symbol to appear, the less information the symbol brings. In other words, the degree of surprise that you have when you see a new symbol appear is proportional to the amount of information that that symbol carries. So that's the definition of information. That information erases completely the meaning of the symbol. In Shannon information, there is no relevance whatsoever to the meaning of symbols. For us, information is simply the carrier of meaning. What we want to communicate is meaning, not symbols. But once we make this definition of the information and we call it information, we are now, from the scientific point of view, we're dealing only with symbols. We do not deal with meaning anymore because it was eliminated from the definition of information at the outset. And the same now is true with intelligence. The intelligence, which is based on consciousness, comprehension, creativity, free will, and so on, that's been eliminated in the definition of intelligence as it relates to computers, because computers have none of those properties. But because we call it intelligence, then we are confused as to what is our intelligence then? Because we're basically defined as machines by the need to measure what we do. But we cannot measure all that we do. We cannot measure our feelings.
Yeah.
And so science must go beyond the limits of numbers or real numbers. They must go beyond those limits. And in fact, already quantum physics must use complex numbers to express in n-dimensional spaces to express a quantum state. That is not the case with classical physics, where you can express the state of a system in an n-dimensional real space, not quantum. And even beyond that, complex numbers do not represent physical variables. They represent probabilities. They're called probability amplitudes, which is completely different. A probability is not a physical thing. Probability does not exist. Probability is simply something that conscious beings generated as a concept in order to make predictions about the future. When they don't have enough information about the future, they make predictions. But probability, therefore, implies the existence of consciousness. A computer cannot have the concept of probability because it is not inherent. It is only when you are trying to predict the future that you have to bring into existence this concept of probability. And probability is how quantum physics is described. Quantum physics can only tell you the possible states that manifest through their probabilities. In other words, they give you the probabilities of all the possibilities that might manifest. But quantum physics cannot tell you which one of the n possible states will manifest. That is the collapse of the wave function, which is a random, non-algorithmic event that creates that. That random, non-algorithmic event goes outside any theory. And with this new theory, that is a decision of free will of the field that is involved in this process.
So when I hear you describe that artificial intelligence doesn't meet the criteria of consciousness, I'm wondering too about the inclusion of other forms of consciousness. So for example, animal consciousness, are those mapped in this theory that you have of consciousness? There's like the famous article of what it's like to be a bat, and the interior experience of a bat cannot be experienced by a human. We don't know what it's like to have echolocation.
Absolutely. We cannot know the experience of a bat. We may try to imagine it. If we could communicate with a bat, we could have a better imagination of what. But whatever we do, it will never be a direct transfer of the experience of the bat to our own consciousness.
But the reason I ask that is, can we imagine that there is some form of consciousness that can emerge in artificial intelligence that will be so far into what we know as human consciousness?
No, because it violates the privacy of the conscious experience. If a computer had a conscious experience, you could copy that experience to another computer. That state could be copied to another computer, and that other computer would be identical to the previous one, because what else is there to define that experience? The state may be a state of gazillions of bits, but still is a state that can be copied exactly. That is not true with quantum state. Quantum state is made of gazillions of qubits, which are entangled. They have properties in common that cannot even be represented in a real space. It requires a complex space. And so that entanglement tells you that everything is interconnected in ways that we cannot know. The only way to know that state is by experiencing it. So the field that has that state can experience that, but that experience is not a number. They are not numbers that can be then transformed into bits, for example. No, a qubit is an infinity of possibility connected with other infinity of possibilities with other qubits. And when you try to express it outside with shareable symbols, a qubit becomes a bit. And you will only see a small portion of that in that classical information that you convert. So we're talking about two completely different type of realities. And of course, that's why quantum physics already intuit that from the very early days, the fathers of quantum physics, they kind of got the sense that consciousness and the quantum reality has something in common, but it could never be articulated in a way that it could become a physical theory. Now, with this work that I've done with Professor Dariano, who is an expert in quantum information, now this is a real physical theory that articulates the fundamental differences between conscious experience and classical experience, which is not an experience, it's a classical state. You cannot have an experience of a classical state unless you transform a classical state into qualia. And the body can do that. The body is an instrument that allows the conscious field that we are to have an experience in this physical reality in space-time. That is what the body perceives. So the purpose of this is for the field to know itself, not for the body to know itself. The body does not have consciousness. Even if the physical body does not have consciousness. The consciousness is in the field that's connected, that communicates with the body. So there are three levels of reality. There is the field where there is consciousness, free will is in the field. Then there is the classical reality, which is what the body perceives. And then the body that is a bridge, that is a quantum classical structure, is not a classical structure. The body is quantum and classical. The cells are quantum and classical systems, and we are made of cells. So the body is a bridge between the quantum world of experience, the semantic world, and the symbolic world of classical information. So if we understand this simple picture, it's very clear that when the body dies, then we continue to exist. We are not the body. Science is saying that we are the body. So when the body dies, that's the end of us. That's a big consequence of what the scientific view today is. The scientific view is the materialistic view that consciousness is a property of the brain. When the brain doesn't work or is destroyed, that's it. We are gone. Now, there are near-death experiences, for example, are showing clearly that is not true. And of course, my first awakening experience, my consciousness was outside of the body. So if consciousness is a property of the brain, how can it be outside of me? How can I perceive myself as outside of my body?
Yeah, and I think what you're talking, so I'm always trying to kind of bring it back to the felt experience in a way that the listeners can relate to. And so we think about the three states of consciousness. There's waking consciousness, there's deep sleep, and there's dream. And the fact that there's a continuation of that, that if you think about, the materialist view that once the body dies, consciousness dies, like we don't experience that in a cycle when we're go to sleep at night. We don't lose everything that happened before and we're reborn every day. We have a continuation of consciousness that continues through those three states.
That's right. But there are also extraordinary states of consciousness that go way, way beyond this, like out-of-body experiences, for example. Millions of people have had out-of-body experiences. Near-death experiences, for example, which hundreds of thousands of people have had. And so where basically our consciousness ranges outside of the body. It's not even the body is asleep in the bed and the consciousness is exploring this reality and other realities. Is that all made up by the brain? Well, maybe, but in the near-death experience, the brain doesn't work. It's not working. So how can a non-working brain create an experience which is so powerful that it changes the life of the person that had that experience? Science today cannot explain any of those phenomena. This theory that I'm describing can perfectly explain those phenomena. In fact, it explains, to my knowledge, pretty much all the phenomena that are not considered valid in the sense or reproducible by science. But it is science that has realized that quantum states cannot be reproduced. So they themselves have found that there is a piece of reality, the most fundamental piece of reality, which is the quantum state, that cannot be cloned, cannot be reproduced. Never mind where, in the lab or elsewhere, cannot be reproduced. That's a theorem of quantum physics.
Yeah.
The quantum state of a cell cannot be reproduced anywhere. It's impossible to reproduce by the admission of quantum physicists, by the theorem that says so.
Well, I want to thank you for your generosity with your time and your knowledge and the profundity of this book, Irreducible, this new book that's out in English now. Any closing thoughts or wisdom you want to impart us with, or anything, hopefulness about the future in terms of our relationship to understanding consciousness?
Yeah, I think that what this new theory offers is a way to understand nature that instead of justifying competition, instead of justifying greed and all the things that we do that end up damaging humanity and the ecosystem, will actually show if we do something positive for someone, then we do something positive for ourselves. If we do some ill things to others, we actually do something ill to ourselves, because since everything is interconnected, what you do is not separate from yourself, and so it will find its way to come back to you, good or bad. And so we have to learn how to work cooperatively in order to create a better world and solve the enormous problems that we have in front of us. And this theory provides the foundation, the logical and powerful foundation to develop a new science. I call it Nusim, with capital N, the Nous for higher intellect and Sim for symbol, that unites science and spirituality, unites the inner and the outer into a new way of imagining and relating that can actually change the world. But we have to believe in ourselves. We have to become responsible for our own life, and that can only occur if we change the idea of who we are.
Beautiful, beautiful place to leave it. Thank you so much for this conversation.
Thank you, Mike.
And thank you for listening to The Sounds of Sand. We invite you to explore more of our talks, dialogues, videos, articles, events, and offerings through our website, scienceandnonduality.com. If you've enjoyed this conversation, please consider becoming a member to access our massive library of Sand content, available exclusively to Sand members. And we would love it if you could leave us a review on Apple Podcasts, Google, and Spotify. And share this episode with your family, friends, and all sentient beings. Be well.